When I was thinking about this morning about where we like to cross the boundary of safe canned arguments and memorize talking points, I was thinking of, like the movies where it's like, don't go past this border, like it's dangerous, right? You don't want to go there. And as everyone's like, well, what's over there? It's just like, just don't go there. Do you guys remember The Village? Did you ever see that?
Yeah, M. Night Shyamalan.
Yes. Okay, so spoiler alert.
What a twist.
Right? Spoiler alert, like if you haven't seen it, that there was like society, like real life happening on the other edge. And that's not unusual. Like that's a storyline that's been used before. And I just kind of feel like that's what ATA is. Like all of the safe arguments, it's like, let's stay right here on the stuff I have memorized and the stuff that I know, and like not go beyond it. As I know that in our community, in the Christian community, Steve, that happens a lot. I don't know about in the atheist communities, like just stick to talking points and don't really dig into arguments. Do you experience that?
It depends on the argument and the interlocutors. I mean, there are a lot of atheists and non-believers out there that actually do know the arguments, that can discuss the arguments at length. But then you have the atheist activist kind of people that I think a lot of them have canned responses and Pavlovian responses and just parrot things. And that's one of the things that I've been after for so long, to have them up their game, because you know what they're going to say before they're going to even say it, because they don't know the actual arguments.
Exactly. And that's a safe place to say. The Fuz, I'm dying to know, I was thinking about this again this morning. You're so into comic books. Please tell me that, has this storyline been used in any comics where it's like, don't go beyond this border because you don't know what's out there?
I'm sure that it has. I can't think of anything.
How about Logan's Run?
Oh, well, yeah, Logan's Run was something.
They weren't supposed to go outside the city.
Yeah.
Oh, yeah. And also, okay, yeah, I'm going to embarrass myself here, but Moana, I'm just saying, Moana, don't go beyond the reef because it's not safe. And so all of that, let's jump into the not safe conversation that we're having today about, can science explain the unexplainable? And I'm looking forward to this. I am sure you guys are going to answer all my questions for me today, because when I talk to my atheist friends, it's like falls in one of two categories. It's like, if you can't provide me scientific evidence, something that's empirical, something that's testable, I'm not going to believe it. Then if there is empirical, scientific, testable evidence, well, then it's not a miracle and it's not supernatural, so I'm not going to believe it. So I'm like, well, I'm kind of hosed either way. So I don't know, like, I know that's not solely where we're going. So Fuz, why don't you and Steve kind of fill us in on where this conversation's going today?
Well, I mean, maybe the place we could start is, when you start thinking of this question that, that we used to title the show, can science explain the unexplainable? I mean, that really is a very complex question that starts to bring into play questions about what is science and how do you distinguish between science and non-science and then pseudoscience, kind of the demarcation problem. So this is really, a pretty complex set of questions that flow out of this larger question that we're playing around with today. And the fact of the matter is, philosophers really can't define science, nor can they really distinguish, the boundaries. But from my perspective, I actually am of the opinion that science can probe questions relating to the supernatural or to the preternatural. And, to me, if you're talking about the supernatural or the preternatural, you're ultimately talking about the activity of agency. And science, in my opinion, does have the toolkit to detect whether or not agency has been involved in a particular phenomena or a particular feature of nature, and can actually even go one step further and provide insight as to what's the purpose, behind the feature that we're looking at, what might be the motivation, what might even be the capacity of that intelligent agent. And science is also really good at characterizing things that we cannot directly observe or even indirectly observe. So we talk about subatomic particles, or we talk about things like strings, in theoretical physics. And then also science is even venturing into characterizing that which is outside of our universe when you bring to bear multiverse theory. So if science is able to do those things, I think it's just an extension of that methodology to begin to explore questions relating to the supernatural and the preternatural. So I actually think science can weigh in on these kinds of questions.
Boy, you just jumped on in that, didn't you? Oh man, there was so much there. Okay, first, I do love this topic, and one of the reasons I love this topic is because I happen to love science, and I see a lot of people that are interested in science and they discount the whole concept of philosophy, although they're intricately related. Science came from natural philosophy, but to me, they answer very different types of things. Science, the whole job of science, and one of the reasons it doesn't explain supernatural and causation is because it does adhere to a type of philosophical standard called methodological naturalism, meaning that it cannot conclude any kind of supernatural causation. It cannot posit any kind of supernatural causation. But what the job is for science is to observe a phenomenon, a natural phenomenon, and give a natural explanation for it. That is what science does. If there's anything that's non-natural, and I don't think preternatural is non-natural. Preternatural is just really unexpected, one-off kind of stuff, but it does happen. But science cannot determine anything relating to supernatural causation. But they answer two different things. Science will look at something and say, okay, how do I explain this? How do I account for it? Philosophy has a very different approach. Philosophy, it takes the approach, how do I account for things that above the science level? Like, what is a fact? What is the truth? What is knowledge? How do we acquire knowledge? So you have metaethics and metaphysics, and these things are questions about reality, right? They're questions about the underlying conditions for things that science doesn't have any way of determining one way or another. Sia had mentioned earlier about empiricism. People were saying, well, hey, if God exists, can I test for it? But I think that they have a wrong approach there, because when we're testing for something, all we're doing is saying, this is how we're observing something. Do we appear that is real about reality, right? If you're what's called a scientific realist, you'll say that, okay, models will look at something and this will be exactly how it actually is in reality. But that's all science tends to do, is try to explain what we're observing and give an accounting for it, while philosophy gives a very different type of accounting as far as how we know things, or what is the guiding force behind science.
Yeah, well, it seems to me that probably where we are differing is the influence or the role of methodological naturalism in the operation of science. And I concur with you today that contemporary science does operate with methodological naturalism as being kind of the constraints on science. And as somebody who is a scientist and also someone who's a Christian, I have kind of a love-hate relationship with methodological naturalism. I understand why people have that as a component of contemporary science. But on the other hand, I don't know that you necessarily have to have methodological naturalism as the framework to do science. I think as long as you're formulating a model or a theory or a hypothesis that produces testable predictions, and we can get into the whole discussion of falsifiability and verifiability and all that fun stuff.
Believe it or not, I'm not a falsificationist. I think Popper's kind of off on falsificationism.
Yeah, well, I think that most scientists, pragmatically speaking, try to verify their.
Yeah, I mean, it's a lot more inductive and deep. I mean, nobody wants to have their theory just falsified, but at the same time, you do try to find evidence to support you. I mean, the first thing a scientist will do is guess. Why is this the case? Oh, let's make a guess and see, and refine that guess into a hypothesis, to a testable hypothesis, and then if it makes it into a theory, even better.
So what scientists do, and isn't always. It's pretty messy, and many times when the story is told, there's a lot of rewriting to make it seem like you're adhering to this wonderful
Well,
process.
the problem is if you don't have methodological naturalism, then basically you can have any type of causation because God done did it, right? I mean, that is something that you hear very often in the unbeliever camp is God done did it. What's the explanation for this? I did a presentation on my channel once on polonium halos, which was Richard Gentry's work. And eventually, when it came out that there was a scientific explanation for these polonium halos, his explanation was, well, God done did it as a singularity, meaning a one-time off single event that God made it this way, which took it out of the realm of science, right? Yeah. And put it into a, okay, well, this is like non-explanatory, right? Because if you say God did something, that doesn't really explain much. It just is a non-explanatory factor because we're in philosophy, we're looking for a metaphysical explanation or a metaphysical justification or accounting for something. And that's not an explanation. God, an agent doing something is not an explanation, right? If I say, hey, if I throw you a ball, why did the ball leave my hand and go to you? Well, yeah, sure, I threw it as an agent, but that's not an explanation. The explanation is the theory of gravity and mechanics and kinematics and physics. That is the accounting for why the ball left my hand and was tossed to you. Right?
Yeah, well, I guess I would take the view that, that I mean, and first of all, I'm sympathetic to your point about the polonium halos, and that's why I think methodological naturalism does have value. But on the other hand, I think there are instances where the data actually is pointing you in the direction that there was agency involved, and I think that's a bona fide explanation for why there's
what does it explain? Like, for example, if I want an accounting of why. If I throw you a baseball, why did the baseball go to you, right? Science explains this, right? Kinematics explains parabolic trajectories. But an agent throwing something, it's not an explanation. It's, okay, somebody threw something, right? We're looking for an accounting. We're not looking for, okay, what's a mundane, normal reasoning, right? In fact, philosophy definitions come to play a lot on that.
I don't think those two things are mutually exclusive. In other words, you could say, that this particular phenomenon in nature does indeed appear to be the work of agency. And then you could have discussions as, well, how did that agent affect that particular phenomenon?
Well, that's what science does. I mean, if we see like a Bronze Age weapon, right, we'll say, okay, we know what agent designed this, how this come into being, how this come into existence. What's the ontology here? Oh, it is because somebody actually took it, hammered it out, did the metallurgy and made it, shaped it. That, the final form, the Aristotelian forms, there's a cause, there's a final form. We know those things. Those would be the explanation. Those would be the metaphysical accounting for why that sword exists. To say, oh, I've seen a sword or an arrowhead, must be an agent that did it, doesn't explain anything. And I think the same thing goes for a metaphysical explanation of existence. Okay, things exist, God. What does that explain?
Yeah, well, why don't we, before we get too far into this, bring in our friend Mark Perez.
Yes, I was talking to him earlier before the show. I was like, this is gonna be awesome.
And I've known Mark for almost 20 years, I bet. And since I started with Reasons to Believe, Mark was already actively involved with RTB as a volunteer. And Mark wears many hats, and one of them is a hat of a philosopher of science. And so we thought you'd be a great person to join the show today, Mark, and help Steve and I through this fun question.
Guide us.
Thanks.
Yeah. But anyway, why don't you just introduce yourself real quickly to the audience, and then we could maybe ask you to weigh in. What do you think about what you've heard, and what do you think about the question?
There's not much to introduce. You basically made the point that my background, particularly academically, is a BA in philosophy, general philosophy, and an MA in analytic philosophy of science with a stream of teaching critical thinking and logic. And so the relevance of that to this particular discussion is that the question that's being posed is particularly philosophical and specifically philosophy of science. Anytime we ask the question, what does science say about? As soon as you've mentioned those words, you've gotten into maybe getting into a very particular philosophy of science question. And when we ask the question, can science detect the supernatural, for example? There are all sorts of interesting questions involved in that. And that's exactly why I was so interested in being here, because as I've already heard you guys talk, you're bouncing around all over philosophy and not very much into science.
It's almost the whole the domain of discourse is pretty much in philosophy when you're talking about can science explain things that are unexplainable or miraculous of some kind, which to me, when I hear the word miracle, and again, this is stipulative, I think it's really, I'm not a prescriptionist, and a lot of people think that I am for some reason. Some of the atheist activists think I am. I'm not. Let me get it on record. I am a descriptivist. However, there is a soft prescriptivism to be had.
Steve, you don't. What is a prescriptionist? And
a prescriptivist would say you must use a word a certain way, right? A grammar Nazi would be a prescriptivist, right? So in philosophy, the words have very, very technical meanings to them. And basically, as a soft prescriptivist would be somebody who says, hey, look, if you want to understand this stuff, these are the ways you have to use these terms, just because you have a discourse on it. But mostly when you have a word that describes something, if you look in a dictionary, it says, okay, this word then has a definition. Those are just descriptions. But a nominal word, for example, like the word accounting, people say, well, what accounted for this? Well, Fuz would say, okay, an intelligent agent accounted for this. We have an arrowhead we found. An intelligent agent accounted for this, right? But that'd be the science behind it. Yes. That'd be the explanation for an agent, but it doesn't explain the science behind the accounting of why the arrow was there. I mean, who created the arrow? Yeah, an agent. But why the arrow exists is because somebody actually used physics to make it. Does it make sense?
But when you look at archaeology, which to me I think is a really great place to begin kind of this whole discussion, because in archaeology you have scientists that are saying, okay, here's a rock, here is a stone tool, and I can actually determine that the difference between these two, that one is the product of natural processes, the other is actually the work of an agent, and I can even get insight as to what was that agent's capability, why would this agent actually manufacture this tool, right? And so you can get insight into motivation and capacity, and these are considered to be scientific conclusions that are drawn in archaeology. And so to me, the question is, well, why couldn't you take the same criteria that archaeologists use to determine if a stone tool is, again, or a rock is the product of agency or natural processes, and apply it to, let's say, biochemical systems, right? To things like the origin of life problem. It seems to me that you could use that same criteria and you could, conclude, or, one way or the other, whether or not agency was involved. And I don't see that as being metaphysical. I see that as actually being a scientific question. I think it does lend it, the line between when it becomes metaphysical and when it becomes science, I think blurs, most definitely. But I don't see why agency isn't a valid scientific explanation.
When you talked about the origin of life, that's a particularly important one, because when you look at the origin of life question, the science of it right now is bashed into all sorts of brick walls. And so we're no closer to knowing what the origin of life scenario is today than we were 100 years ago. We may think we are, but nobody has a biochemical description of how life originated from non-life. Now the question is, if we're going to call that science, that we're going to be trying to discover how did life originate from non-life, there's an open question there. And one of them is it biochemical? And the other one is it not biochemical? If it's not biochemical, what is it? Now, can we use the supernatural, or as Steve talked about, saying God did it? Can we use that as an explanation? Well, there's nothing intrinsic to the question that bars that. So if you're in a position, for example, like the origin of life, which is so incredibly difficult, can we look at both of those explanations, or even there could be a third explanation? Somebody from outside the solar system came in and created it. We'll just use those three scenarios. And the question then is, are any of those barred intrinsically by science? And the answer is no. There's nothing in science that can stop any one of those three explanations from being pursued. So at what point do we make the decision to go outside of continuing to look for or allege that only a biochemical explanation is going to be there, and that it isn't some agency, whether it's some alien from another, distant planet with super brains, or a God who's transcendent and who can operate in both the domain that he occupies and a domain that we occupy simultaneously and in either one. Now, so when Steve earlier was talking about the question, well, you don't need an agency if we're going to look at the parabola, and that, he's absolutely right about that, because that's the question of who did it and not how it was done. But we're at a question of origins. The how it is done may just be exactly who did it.
Well, because you're looking for metaphysical explanations, right? So it's not just like strictly like life from non-life, right? Abiogenesis like that. The explanation of why we exist at all. Why is there a universe? Why do we have consciousness? These are all things that we're seeking metaphysical explanations for, right? Now, I think a lot of theologians I talk to will try to use this all-encompassing umbrella to say, well, what explains consciousness? What explains life from non-life? What explains the universe being here, the Big Bang? God. But that to me is a non-explanatory causation, because one, I don't subscribe to the principle of sufficient reason, but even if I did, what does it explain? If you're going to say a God created the universe, right, or created life from non-life, then the question, it raises the question, well, how did he do this, right? Because we want an accounting, we want an explanation of how something was done. An agent doing something is a non-explanatory thing. It just means, okay, Fuz did this, or you did this, or somebody did this. Okay, but that doesn't explain how he did it. And without having the ability to ask God, how did you do this, right? It doesn't really get us anywhere. It goes back to the whole, thing like the argument from contingency, that if God created the universe, if God created everything, that is one possible metaphysical explanation, yes. But there are other options, as you pointed out. There's multiple options. It could be an infinite regress. It could be, a brute fact. And I don't see positing something saying, okay, God explains this as an explanation. Is that?
Well, what is there in science that requires there to be an explanation?
None actually. I mean, I agree. I don't think there actually is a requirement. I don't subscribe to principle of sufficient reason. I do accept brute facts. I do accept foundationalism. I do accept axiomatic assumptions. But I think science at least assumes that there's a possibility of some kind of explanation, right? I mean, so if we see a tornado, and we say, hey, how does this work? We assume there has to be a natural phenomenon having a natural explanation. And if we can't figure it out, science says, hey, we're unable to figure that out until such point they learn more about science. And they usually go back and revisit something and go, hey, look, yeah, we didn't know how to do that 20 years ago. We know now we can explain this.
I think that's where I think that's where I want to jump in on this is, we've kind of been digging down into origins of life, about the Big Bang, things that are natural, and trying to find what the origins are. And of course, like when we discuss this, like there are so many things that are in the breadth of what we would consider supernatural. But just talking on that, I think Mark posited the question about at what point do we entertain the idea that it could be supernatural. And I think that there is a lending in the scientific community and in the skeptic community of anti-supernatural presuppositionalism. And
you just made that up, didn't you?
Yes, I did. that we're presupposing, where we've already decided that it is not supernatural. Period. So exactly what you just said, Steve.
Well, that's science, though. Science does that. Now,
that isn't science. Science is supposed to say where does the evidence lead?
No,
and if you start out with that it is absolutely not supernatural, that is not necessarily
that's not what science says. Science says it cannot posit a supernatural causation. It doesn't say one can't exist. It doesn't stick a stand on either way. Stephen Jay Gould had a really good term called non-overlapping magisteria. which basically said, hey, you know what? You've got two different domains, two different teachings. You have religion and you have science, right? And science talks about this, theology and religion talk about this, and they just stay in their lanes, right? That's fine. A theological explanation for something, if a philosophical explanation for something, if people posit a God as something along those lines in philosophy, that's fine. It doesn't work for science though, because here's the thing: if science allows for those types of causations, then God or any other supernatural being could supposedly change the laws of physics at any time, right? He has that ability to do so. If he created the laws of physics, he can change them on a dime, and that goes against humans' uniformity of nature. So we assume there's some kind of uniformity there. We assume that the sun's going to rise tomorrow because it rose every other day, right? We assume that the laws of logic will work tomorrow. But if God exists, it throws that out the window. Science goes
no, it doesn't, because that's a character thing now of whatever said God you're talking about. There's a presupposition there that God will be capricious and change things up, and so therefore we cannot know. So yes, even what you said, Steve, is that science will hit the pause button if there's not something that's readily explainable. It won't lend itself at all to the potential of Mark even posited the idea of, like, let's not say God, let's say beings from another planet, but no, science will not follow it. Fuz, go ahead. Sorry.
But this is where, I mean, I think that the crux of the different of perspectives has to do with the influence of methodological naturalism. And is methodological naturalism essential for the operation of science? So I actually am sympathetic to your points, Steve, about if you don't have methodological naturalism in place, you can wind up with a free-for-all where it's really not helpful. But on the other hand, I think methodological naturalism can introduce artificial constraints on the operation of science that prevent science from actually being able to discover the truth about a particular question, and rather is confining you to a particular category of explanations, whether that category of explanations is correct or not. So let's go back to the origin of life, not to beat a horse here that's no longer living. But it's interesting to me that you see countless original life researchers in these pensive moments say, it looks as if the origin of life is a miracle. I can name, off the top of my head, probably 10 or 15 original life researchers that have made that statement or in print someplace where they've made that statement. And then, of course, sometimes it's tongue in cheek, but it really is expressing the fact that we're not getting anywhere with chemical evolutionary approaches. But then they'll stop and they'll say, but even if it looks like it's a miracle, we're not going to go there because we're going to pursue mechanistic explanations. So what they've done is they've come right up to the very edge and said, it really looks like there might be something here that's miraculous or that is requiring agency, but then they stop short of that. And so I actually like an approach to science where you employ soft methodological naturalism, where you say, let's start and look for mechanistic explanations. But if the data is saying it looks like agency, or we're not getting anywhere through mechanistic explanations, let's at least open it up to the possibility that there may be the supernatural involved, and then ask the question, if that's the case, can we actually probe that? And I'm not convinced that science can't probe, the supernatural. Maybe not exhaustively, but can at least begin to engage that idea. So anyway,
but how would it do that if the supernatural has no rules?
Well, but in a sense, how does science characterize the multiverse, right? I mean, the multiverse is something that we can't observe. We can't put the multiverse.
Level one. I think we can observe a level one.
Well, but
I read Jeff Serg's book.
Yeah, but when you start talking about level 2 multiverses, right? But yet this is considered to be legitimately part of science. But in effect, the multiverse is no different than appealing to the supernatural. To explain, I mean, the multiverse is the explanation for the fine-tuning of the constants of physics.
But these things stem out of other things, right? I mean, string theory comes out of mathematical modeling, right?
but it's not a, but again, I mean, mathematical modeling is all well and good, but it's still not, technically speaking, science, because it's not, if it is a theoretical construct, then, and there's no way to make it any kind of observation or perform any kind of experiment, then is it really, is it really science, or is it actually metaphysics masquerading as science?
No, I think it's fine. I think a lot of people think science, for some reason, like, again, they're so empirical that, okay, it has to be observed, it has to be repeatable. A lot of scientific experiences are not repeatable. Matter of fact, there's a huge replication issue in peer review. But a lot of the sciences are there. Look, when somebody first posited the neutrino, we didn't observe it, right? They're like, hey, this kind of has to exist because we're seeing energy, being going away. Where's it going? Let's posit this particle that has these specific properties to it. And then all of a sudden, later on, they discover the neutrino, right? Same thing with the Higgs boson. So it's fine for science to do that, I think.
I want to jump in and ask Mark a question. Steve has brought up, Mark, tell me what your thoughts are on this. Steve has brought up and kind of protested a number of times, saying that if the supernatural has no rules, then, how are we to be able to measure it? Or how would you put that, Steve? If the supernatural has no
if the supernatural, okay, we have laws are descriptive, right? Laws of physics descriptive, right? And Mark pointed out, I could look at a kinematic thing and I could see a parabolic trajectory, which is actually an elliptical trajectory, but I can mathematically model it and say, look, here's the initial conditions, here's my final conditions. I can do that. But if God comes in and says, hey, look, I can change these things anytime. I can slow this resistance, or change this resistance, this friction, this coefficient here, the fine tuning constant, the fine structure constant, anything that God changes will mess everything up, kind of thing. And he could be capricious, like you said. He could be a mercurial God and just want to mess with people and say, hey, you know what? I'm going to change things enough just to keep people on their toes, if he supposedly wanted to. Again, you're presupposing that he doesn't. But
and you're presupposing that he does. And so, but that's what I'm asking. What is your
I'm not presupposing anything, because I don't think God exists, right?
But your argument is that the beef that you have, Steve, is that the supernatural it doesn't follow any rules. Is that what you're?
Yeah, well, because again, I can model a behavior or something descriptively, right? But if you have God allowing for supernatural causations and he does things, how do you model that? How do you formulate things? How do you categorize that? How do you do any empirical analysis or qualitative analysis of that? I don't see any way you could possibly do it, because God could change anything.
Okay, so Mark, how would you respond to that challenge? Because Steve keeps going back to that. So I want to know if there's any way to resolve that.
Yeah, I think one of the ways to look at this is, first of all, the term supernatural is vague, so we need to be clear about what we're talking about.
Yeah, it is.
So if we're going to be talking about God particularly, if we're going to talk about God particularly of the Bible, then one of the things we have to ask is, not merely is God arbitrary or capricious and he could just come in and twist the laws any way he wants, but the question is, would he have a reason to keep the laws exactly the way they are to prove his existence? In other words, are the clarity and uniformity of the laws of physics as we see them proof of the existence of God? And the answer is yes.
I would say it has no benefit either way. I mean, to me, that's ad hoc, because
well, it's not ad hoc. The question is what you asked earlier is, does supernatural have no rules? And the question about God in particular, well, God actually does have some rules, and he imposes those rules and as an expression of his character of consistency, coherency, logic, etc. Now, that isn't alone the argument for the existence of God. But what I'm getting at is that when you look at the laws of physics as we see them, they're very clearly uniform, reliable, etc., which is consistent with the nature of God as the Christian God is known.
It'd also be consistent with a God that doesn't exist too. We're presupposing that the uniform nature has to be presupposed, right? You agree it's non-justifiable. We cannot justify the use of even an induction for that very reason, but we still utilize it, right?
We still use it when we see repeated events and we can make law-like statements about them, and that they occur everywhere they're tested, and that attempts to falsify them fail, that this is uniformity. And the greater the extent and explanatory power of those law-like statements, the more we believe in the uniformity. So you're right. The problem of induction is next week it could change, and we have no access to the future. But understanding that we don't have access to the future isn't to say that suddenly the laws are going to change.
No, yeah, and I don't think they're going to change either. But if they did, well, I mean, correct me if I'm wrong. I remember reading something about the fine structure constant it being slightly have some variance in it at some parts of the universe.
And what does that imply?
Well, that there might be bubbles in the initial conditions of the universe that didn't have the exact same physics as we have.
Okay, I wouldn't dispute that. I'm not a scientist, so I'm not going to dispute any one of those particular what I call law-like statements. The question is, overall, when you look at the world as it is it rational? Does it look to be uniformity? And if it is uniformity and uniform, and just as you said, although it does signify or allow the inference to a God who is logical and wants us to be able to operate in a realm that's predictable so that we can live rationally and according to the way he wants us to live. It could also be a total brute fact. Just say it's just there. The question is, which of those two arguments is more well-founded?
Well, quick question, because could not God, I mean, God has supposedly done miracles. He has suspended the laws of physics. I mean, supposedly somebody came back from the dead 3 days later. Actually, there's been numerous people supposedly in the Bible that came back from the dead. That'd be a suspension of biological facts. That'd be a suspension of biological things that we understand are not possible, scientifically speaking. Now, whether logically possible, sure, coming back from the dead is logically possible. I know a lot of non-believers, I say that, and they cringe, but they don't understand the use of logic in that term. Logically, it's possible means there's no logical contradiction, right? Now, if I said a person's live and not live at the same time, that's not going to happen. That is logically impossible. But coming back from the dead is merely a physics problem. It's impossible according to science, but in philosophy and logic, there's nothing illogical about that. But God can suspend those things, right? God can say, hey, I'm going to suspend this for these miracles. Why can't he suspend or change the laws of physics if he wanted to?
Well, he could. That's the question isn't whether he can. The question is whether he does. And I've also heard it said that the miracles were not a suspension or an alteration of the laws of physics. They were intrusions of a particular event that didn't fit the laws of physics into the world scheme. So it's not like all of a sudden the laws of physics stopped, the resurrection occurred, then the laws of physics got turned back on again.
Yeah, there's like one-time events, like Gentry's singularity, right? I mean, he just called these things one-offs.
Yes,
but this is a situation where, if you can demonstrate that the resurrection happened, so that let's say you made a successful historical argument, for the resurrection. I think you can, but I'm just saying, let's just suppose that for the sake of the discussion now. And we know that, again, there's no mechanism that we know biologically for somebody who is dead to come back to life, or who is properly dead, as my friend, Dr. Bernard Palmer says, who's a British guy. Somebody's properly dead, they don't come back from.
They're done.
They're done, right? So that would be a place where you'd say, okay, we don't have a mechanism that can explain this, but it was a real event. So it looks as if something beyond, nature happened, beyond something that was supernatural happened, or that there's the work of agency involved in the resurrection of Jesus in this case, right? So this is a place where I think science can actually probe that question, at least getting you up to the point where you'd say scientifically, we can actually establish that this is an event that took place where, again, it's operating outside the laws of nature. So I see that as actually a scientific process, because you're looking to see, are there natural process explanations, and then if you conclude that they're not, that's actually a scientific.
How would you ever know that you ran out of all possible natural explanations? Because if we would have done that, thousands of years ago, we would never discovered anything. Thousands of years ago, they probably thought, hey, we knew everything there was to know. I mean, they were pretty arrogant scientists a long time ago saying, hey, science is something new under the sun kind of thing. But don't you think that if science had not continue to refine itself and learn precept by precept and build upon the basis that, hey, look, we may not be able to understand this now or explain it now. We're going to table it until a point where we can, and they come back and revisit it. Science has almost always seemed to come back and find explanations for things that at one time they didn't think was even explainable, or at least very difficult to explain.
And that's I mean, it's a fair point. How can you ever truly exclude every possible explanation, and say that there is no natural process explanation? I grant that point. But you can at least say as everything that we know at this point in time looks as if, that we've exhausted our explanations, right? And if it looks like it's a real event, and we could even do one, we could again take a page out of the book of an archaeologist. We could do experimental type of archaeology, right? Where we could go and say, is there any way that we could actually bring somebody back from the dead, right? When we are working as agents, and if we conclude we can't,
like dead, like dead.
Yeah. So in other words, we could try we could say, well, this doesn't naturally happen. Is there any way that we could, intervene medically and bring somebody back from the dead? And the answer is we don't know how to do that. So if this is again established as a real event, then we would conclude that this is obviously something that goes beyond, human capabilities. So you would begin to posit, the capability of that agent that brought, the dead person back to life.
Well, let me.
I think it.
I just want to throw in here, because we did
Sure.
promise, our friends on the front end of this, that not just biblical miracles and things that we see, like with the universe, the beginning of the universe, or the origin of life. We promise them things that almost cross over into spiritual and maybe paranormal, that if you have something, say like the Shroud of Turin, that scientists have examined this, and they have tried to identify how the imprint got made, and it's not burned on, it's not painted on, it's not blood. They've ruled all these things out, but they don't know how it was done. Now, Steve, I feel you in saying, if we just throw up our hands and say, oh, well, it was supernatural, then that's the end of the conversation. But does it have to be all or nothing? Can there be an idea of perhaps this is supernatural? We, continue the scientific investigation. And I even look at the parting of the Red Sea. I've seen documentaries where there's a particular wind that blows at a particular time of year, and it can create this parting in the sea. And it's like, okay, so if you can offer an explanation, now it's no longer supernatural. But if you can't offer an explanation, then again, it's just comma until we find the natural explanation. There's no even nod to the potential of that. And what I want to know is, if something is truly supernatural, can it be confirmed by the natural? Because isn't it by its very definition supernatural, above nature? I mean, Mark, you look like you want to say something.
Yeah, I'm very intrigued by that, because there's some interesting thought experiments you can perform that can let you see that you can empirically test the question about supernatural events and supernatural causes. And so, for example, let's say we have a Ouija board. Now, I've never used one, so I don't really know how they're used. But let's say you use it and you move around on it, and it gives you an answer, yes or no, to a question. All right. Well, I know that there's at least one test of that, in which scientists said, well, okay, these people are coming up with answers that are supposedly from some supernatural source. Let's blindfold them. And then they started moving their hands all over the place, and they didn't come up with a yes or no answer. They just came up with nonsense. And so there's an empirical falsification of a claim to the supernatural. Now let's keep pushing this experiment a little bit here. Now let's say they blindfold them, and the person who's playing with the Ouija board says, I'm going to make a prediction, and the Ouija board's going to tell me whether it's accurate. I'm going to predict that tomorrow the lottery numbers are going to be the following 5 sequence. And the Ouija board says, yes. Tomorrow comes, and those are the lottery numbers. Okay, wow, what an interesting freak chance. Then the second day it happens, another freak chance, identical. And we just keep going like that. Now that's an extreme, but my point is, at what point will the scientists say, there's something more going on here than just random chance?
Yeah, well, I think they'd eventually say there's something more going on, but again, will they ever say it's supernatural? No. Would you be able to win well, they don't have any longer, but JREF used to have $1 million for somebody that could do exactly that, right? And they did that for decades, and nobody ever claimed that money because nobody was able to do anything like that. But scientists will never concede and say, look, there is no natural explanation for this. It must be supernatural, because again, that is outside the domain of the magistrate of science. And that I think it needs to stay that way. If science ever concludes something supernatural, it opens up a whole floodgate for other things, right? Because, hey, rainbow, leprechauns. And again, I don't like using leprechauns for the God thing. I think there are different categories there. But in that particular case, why did we see a rainbow? There was supposed to be an explanation for this, right? Well, one of the things in the Bible is that God put a rainbow there to, tell man that we're never going to have a flood again. We don't think that's the actual explanation, though. We know that the rainbow is produced by, light coming through raindrops, and we're seeing the prismatic effect. So we have an explanation for that. And I think that once science throws its hands up in the air and says, hey, look, we can't explain this, even though it's really, something so preternatural that it defies explanation, it destroys what science is supposed to do by finding a naturalistic explanation. As Sia said, that's what science is for, to find a natural explanation. As soon as it finds a supernatural, it's no longer science. It's now some other form of scientific
That's an ontological commitment that's not a scientific commitment.
Well, it's not an ontological commitment, but it is a scientific commitment.
It is an ontological commitment, because you are saying...
Only if you're a metaphysical naturalist would it be an ontological commitment.
Well, either way, whatever way you want to cut it, the ontology is that there is no supernatural being.
No, that would be a metaphysical.
But
that would be a metaphysical, right? I mean, if somebody, there's a difference between a metaphysical naturalist and a methodological naturalist, right? So metaphysical or ontological naturalist, you're right. That is an absolute metaphysical commitment. At that point, to be rational, they have to say there are no gods, there are no spirits, there are no ghosts, Ouija boards don't work. That is a rational line of inference. Would you agree?
Sure.
Yeah. But a lot of scientists don't hold to that, I find. A lot of them have a little bit more flexibility in that department.
Buzz wants to jump in here.
Yeah, but this is where, not to keep, harping on this point, but this is where I think the example of archaeology or the work that's going on in SETI really comes to bear, because archaeology and SETI are, scientific research programs. Mm-hmm. And they, again, are predicated on the ability to distinguish between some kind of natural process phenomena and the work of agency. And so, and the way archaeologists, I've studied this extensively, what both SETI and archaeologists are doing is they're saying, A, does an event look like it's artificial? Does it have artificiality? That's the SETI term. Can we rule out natural process explanations? And then the last point would be, what would it take to reproduce this phenomena? And those are the three criteria. So let's go, to Mark's example, of the Ouija board, right? It looks artificial, right? It looks like there's something, there's a design inference, if you will. As of this point in time, there's no natural process explanation for that. And then we could ask the question, well, how on earth would we ever reproduce that if we were try to engineer it ourselves? And based on that three criteria, I think we would say there looks like there's agency involved, and there's that agency is defying what we understand as natural process explanation. And so that now becomes a legitimate explanation that you arrive at scientifically through the use of the scientific method without violating the integrity of the scientific enterprise. Now, it like everything in science, it's a provisional conclusion, right? And so it very well could be that tomorrow we come up with the explanation for how something like that is possible. And so therefore then that provisional explanation fades away. Or it could be that we spend the next 5 decades and we still can't produce a natural mechanistic explanation for what we've observed with the Ouija board. And then we would conclude, well, this must be, again, or at least the conclusion that this is supernatural stands. So I don't see that as violating the integrity of science. Now, anything that would go beyond, what you could infer from the empirical observations that you have then becomes metaphysics. But you can even begin to play around with what is the motivation, or the capability of that agent that to allow Mark to win the lottery, 5 days in a row, right? Or 5 lotteries in a row.
Well,
so I want to find out, are you guys ready to take on questions? Because I got a lot they're piling up here. Are you good to go with taking
Maybe
on
we
some
could
questions?
see if Mark wants to weigh in before we move to questions.
Okay, Mark.
Just want to make sure Mark gets a chance to.
Yeah, thank you. No, the only thing I would want to reiterate is that the decision to make God, exclude God as a possibility is not necessary in science. And as a matter of fact, once you get to the point where you bump into the boundaries of science, it becomes a perfectly reasonable explanation, or at least a reasonable hypothesis to say, okay, since we can't find out how this is going on, let's just go back to the origin of life. We've done everything we can possibly do, and the evidence continually shows that we can't show this beyond it being a miracle. Let's find out about what does it mean to have a God doing this, and that gives you another round of opportunities for exploration. And the explorations can be negative or positive. In other words, you can try and refute different ways of looking at God's participation in the world, let's say according to the Bible, and according to any religion that you want to. So then it becomes an empirical investigation. And I think that's something that we really need to remember, is that part of the basis for this whole discussion today is, can science access or detect the supernatural? And my answer to that is most certainly yes.
Can I get a 30-second rejoinder on that?
Go for it, Steve.
Yeah, well, first of all, this goes back to an episode we had on teleological versus teleonomic explanations, Fuz, right? I mean, the whole thing was because things look designed, then that was a teleological explanation rather than a teleonomic, and that's one thing that Darwin kind of gave to us. But these things are abductive arguments. For example, if I walk into my kitchen and I see, pieces of bread and lettuce and all of it, and I leave and I come back in, all of a sudden they're made into this nice triple-decker sandwich, I'll be like, oh, my roommate must have made a sandwich, right? Why? Because I've seen him do that before. I've seen a mind do that before. What we've never seen is a mind independent of a body do anything. So an explanation, even for an agent, anything that has intentionality to it, right? We have to have at least an observation of that occurring to have a proper abductive argument, which is the most reasonable explanation for what we observed. And that's one of the things I've always had a problem with these design inferences, is that we've never seen a deity do anything. We've never seen a mind independent of a body do anything as far as an explanatory. Now, of course, people have on faith, and I understand that. People say, well, yes, we saw that 2,000 years ago. I don't know why we don't see it now, because again, if God's going to be consistent, if he was to do this miracle, I'd be cool with that. I'd be like, awesome. But he doesn't seem to do it these days. But anyways, that's my rejoinder.
I could jump in on we could do this all day, but we do have our friends that have their own questions. And I'm sorry, but I did not write down who this was at the beginning. But Mark, I'm going to pitch this one to you. You kind of addressed that this was a question we needed to answer at the beginning. How does one determine that an event or a phenomenon is supernatural to begin with?
Well, that's very difficult to do, because the question of what is natural is itself vague. So let's go back to the question of, say, the laws of physics and the way that they work. So if we have an event, say, let's go back to the Ouija board again. we can test that by finding out whether there are a natural explanation by refuting it. If we do that, it's pretty straightforward. We've just proved that it's not supernatural. But when we get to the point where there are no possible explanations other than that, then it's a reasonable inference. We can't say we're proving it, but it's a reasonable inference. And so my response to that would be, we're making the claim not that the supernatural can be proved, but that it's a reasonable inference from empirical observations.
Well, if you had a Ouija board in the 16th century, right, a spirits board, they would call that witchcraft. They had no explanation. They had no idea what the ideomotive effect was. Now, I will tell you, I've used a Ouija board many times, and it is freaky. I'm not going to front. It feels like it is moving. It is a very weird feeling. I'm telling you, if I didn't, have an explanation for it by the ideomotive effect, then I would be like, yeah, I really did believe at the time that they worked. I mean, I did for a lot of years, actually, because it's very convincing. But if they would have stopped there and they said, hey, this is just a demonic board or spirits or whatever, it clearly cannot be explained by science. And they stopped there, we would have never now known that there is an explanation for it, a natural explanation. Now, somebody doesn't have to believe that, right? Joe could be spirits. Who the hell knows, right? It could be one or the other or both. But at least we have a possible explanation that will explain something that where 400 years ago had they said, there's no explanation for this, right? It must be supernatural causation.
Sure. Well, I guess to be most responsive to the person who's asking the question is that when you cannot explain it naturally, in other words, to the degree that we know things today that are uniform and well established, then it's reasonable to at least propose as an alternative explanation the supernatural. That's as close as we can get.
I want to jump in here because I see a question coming up in a few minutes about, is the reasoning to the supernatural based on kind of a God of the gaps type of argument? Because you bring up, Mark, hey, if we can't explain it through natural means, at least the supernatural is a possibility. And I want to be clear that the approach that I would argue isn't God of the gaps, because again, and I don't know that I've made this clear, but my approach would be modeled after archaeology, where it's not just simply eliminating natural process explanations, but it's actually saying this has the appearance of artificiality, and that when I try to envision what it would take or try to experimentally replicate that particular phenomena in the laboratory, that gives me insight as to, what does it take to produce this kind of feature. So it's not a God of the gaps, but it's rather ticking off three criteria that, again, archaeologists would use or SETI would use to establish agency. So just want to be clear. And I don't think you are arguing for God of the gaps either, Mark.
No, absolutely not. As a matter of fact, that's contrary to what the biblical God would do. God would never ask us to insert him in every unexplained physical phenomenon. But the question is really in situations, particularly origins where there's only a singular event, and how do you explain those singular events? And what are the options for those explanations? That we don't have to use God of the gaps reasoning, but we have to ask ourselves, at what point are we moving into a crisis where the science just will not go any further? And that occurred, by the way, in science itself. Where Newtonian physics did what? It bumped into a giant problem when it started to get into cosmic scales. And so you had literally, as Kuhn put it, there was a time when the Newtonian physicists and Einsteinian physicists were in two different worlds. Now, what does that have to do with this? Well, what it has to do with is there are times when science has to radically change itself and see the world in an entirely different way, in a way that's so severe, so critical, that the two sides are looking at each other and say, we're not even occupying the same space. The word matter, for example, didn't mean the same thing to an Einsteinian as it meant to a Newtonian.
Before we
didn't either.
Before we get another rejoiner here, because the rejoiner was probably about 5 minutes ago. Again, we've got a lot of questions.
Yeah,
And
I got something to add on that.
yeah, I know. But this next one, Steve, was a question for you. It's kind of
well, hang on. I do this. I think it's important I ask this.
But this, I understand. But last time we didn't get to hardly anybody's questions, and we do have our friends that have joined because they do want their questions answered too.
All
So put a pin in that. Sorry. This question is for you, Steve. I have Stacy Wiedmeyer that is asking, Steve, do you believe in the spiritual realm and angels and demons?
I don't. I used to. I'm not, as Mark pointed out, I'm not a methodological. I'm not a metaphysical naturalist. I don't have that ontological commitment. So the possibility exists. But I think Mark very early said something that we kind of glazed over, which was actually very important. What is supernatural? I tend to use a stipulative uses of the term, and basically, supernatural is anything in the set, not in the set of natural, right? So you have a set of natural and non-natural because that's a dichotomy. That is a function of logic. So I just call the supernatural set the non-natural set. However, there are arguments to be say, well, if God exists, he's in reality, therefore he's part of the natural universe. But that's not how I use the term, because supernatural to me is something that's so far off from our understanding to be in a completely different epistemic category of itself, right? Because if God does exist, our minds would not be able to comprehend it, right? I think that most, even the non-believer, most stringent non-believer atheist is going to say, look, God exists. We're not going to be able to apprehend that. It's just not, our minds are not capable of understanding that kind of infinite. We can't understand. Our minds are limited, biologically speaking, to such a degree that we have a hard time understanding the reality we're in. And so when you have an infinite being, we're never going to be able to process that, right? So I put that under something that's supernatural. An angel would be supernatural. Demons would be supernatural. Even if they exist in reality, they're in the non-natural set. Is that a good way to put it, Mark? Would you agree or disagree on that? Because again, you have natural and non-natural. So I just do a semantic substitution and say non-natural would be supernatural there.
Yeah, I think it's more complicated than that, but I really do want to answer the questions. So I'll leave you with your rejoinder and let the questioners come back.
Thank you. This one, Fuz, I'm going to pitch this one to you. Our friend Tim Boyle says, science may require methodological naturalism, at least for empirical science. But when it comes to origins science, doesn't that become philosophical naturalism?
Yeah. Yeah, that's a good question that Tim is asking, and I'm not sure that I would go to the extreme that Tim is going, but I think I see his point. In other words, when we're dealing with empirical science, I've heard people call it operational science. I mean, we are dealing with, from my perspective as a Christian, secondary causation, where we're dealing with processes that God has ordained or has instituted. And so therefore, methodological naturalism is perfectly acceptable. But when it comes to questions of origins, and this is, I think, what we've been kind of discussing today, is does the constraints of methodological naturalism actually dissolve into a type of philosophical naturalism where you are not permitting the possibility of agency to account for, let's say, the origin of life or the origin of the universe. So I'm sympathetic to his point. I would have to think about it a little bit more. Yeah, I would let me just leave it at that.
But that's just a constraint, though. Science uses methodological naturalism as a constraint. Science doesn't slide into, there cannot be any supernatural, right? And I think that's a huge distinction to be made. One is just a constraint of how scientific methodology would be used. That's all. If you want to use scientific method.
Yeah, and I think that, and I'm not disagreeing with you, Steve, but I think part of the concern that Tim is raising is when you are embracing methodological naturalism, in a sense, you are accepting philosophical naturalism as the operating principle for science, right? So in other words, when it comes to the operation of science, there's no distinction between methodological naturalism and philosophical naturalism. So I've heard people refer to methodological naturalism as provisional atheism or benchtop atheism. And I think that's where what Tim is getting at is, at what point does that constraint actually essentially in effect become de facto a philosophical commitment?
Here's a way to look at that, and I won't go too long with this, but if you had the origin of life researchers look at that question and say, we now know the laws of physics will not create life from non-life, what would the scientific community do with that? If the scientific community would say, well, it's not chemical and physical, then what is it? Would the scientific community allow the option of a God to be the explanation? If the answer to that is no, then the methodological naturalism has become philosophical. If the answer to that is yes, then the methodological naturalism is still just a procedure. So I think that's another way of looking at it for Tim's question.
Yeah, but I think there's a slight nuance of what Fuz was saying. There's a difference between science saying we cannot posit a scientific, a supernatural causation for what we observe, as opposed to there cannot be a supernatural causation for what we observe. Those are completely different statements.
No, but what I'm getting at is, if they came to a conclusion that the laws of physics would not create life from non-life, would there be an admission that would be?
I don't think that could ever be. I don't think anybody could actually reach that point. I don't know how that point would ever be reached. Okay. But by the same token, if we did find life, and if for example, like we created life in a lab, right? A lot of people before didn't even know we create amino acid in a lab till Urey Miller came along and say, hey, look, we have an experiment here. We created 6 or so amino acids. That's a big step, right? Because before that, they didn't know how that would actually be creative. So what happens if we did actually create life in a lab from complete non-life? How would that affect your
I wrote an entire book on that called Creating Life in the Lab. and my argument is that
you wrote a book on everything.
Well, maybe not. But to me, my argument in that book is that this actually constitutes a new way to make an argument for God's role in the origin and the basic design of life, in that when we look at what it takes to create protocells, the level of ingenuity is so extensive that it really raises questions about, could natural process mechanisms actually produce living systems? And it shows you again that intelligent agency seems to be an indispensable component to that process. So to me, it's not, if we create life in the lab, does that mean God isn't necessary? Or what does that do to the idea of God's role? It depends on what does it take to create that life in the lab. And everything that I've seen when it comes to work in synthetic biology is the level of ingenuity is so significant, and the control that the researchers have to exert in the laboratory is so significant that I think it's making an empirical argument. Agencies needed to go from chemicals to protocells to true cells.
I'm going to jump in here because that leads to the next question. I just kind of want to put a bow on this one, though. It seems like one of the takeaways, or one of the big takeaways for me from this whole conversation as we're nearing the end of this, is that science, no matter what walls we hit or how long we've hit a wall, what Mark is proposing, can science even admit that the supernatural is potentially implied here or inferred? And Steve, what I'm hearing from you is no. That's just a no, because that is non-science. And I think that's the answer to the pervasive question, is that science will never acquiesce that this is potentially supernatural. It will ad nauseum or ad infinitum just continue to search for some sort of scientific, naturalistic resolution to whatever the enigma is. And I think that's a dividing point. here, I'm just going to jump since Fuz, you were talking about creating life in the lab. I think it's Kay Wisa is asking, he's saying that this is an interesting topic. I'm glad that you're enjoying this. They're asking, I'm curious of whether the belief in God would be shaken if one day scientists actually do create primitive life in the far future. How would religious folk react? And Fuz, I want to pitch that to you because of your book, Creating Life in the Lab, but I would like you and maybe Mark as well, not just say from Fuz, from your scientific perspective, what you've already iterated, that you think that this actually shows the necessity for an intelligence to intervene to create this. I think that's yours. What do you think of religious folk in general? What do, by and large, with Christians, how might they respond? And I'm curious, Mark, how you think that the Christian community, by and large, would respond?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think, in my experience, there's some very remarkable progress made towards creating protocells that really would begin to assume the properties of life. And my experience is that many people in the Christian community are actually highly resistant to the significance of that work. They're highly dismissive of the work. They try to diminish the accomplishments. And I find that actually to be really sad, because in my view, the people that are doing this work are among the best scientists in the world that are really pressing forward, the frontiers of science, and are generating some really fundamental understanding about the nature of life at a molecular level. So it saddens me to see that level of dismissal. But again, in the book Creating Life in the Lab, I tried to point out that this is actually a really good thing, for the design argument. If I could, I know Mark wants to jump in, but I just wanted to respond to something you said as you're trying to wrap everything up in a bow. And I just want to make sure people understand that Mark and I both have the highest regard for science, just as Steve does. And I think part of, if I could take Steve's position for a minute, I think part of the reason why there is this resistance to going down the path of the supernatural has to do with the concern on the part of scientists that are we going to actually erode the integrity of science? Are we going to undermine the integrity of science by appealing to the supernatural? So for many scientists, they see a lot at stake, which is part of the resistance. It's not just simply philosophical, it's really a concern of undermining the integrity of science, which is why I've tried to argue, again, from the examples of archaeology or from the examples of SETI, how we could approach this question while retaining the integrity of the science. So anyway, sorry for that.
So yeah, I think my answer to your question, what would Christians think if they created life in the lab? And I think there would be several camps. One of them would be awash in fear, thinking that somehow that the Genesis 1 had been disproved. And that would be because they don't know enough about the question to really understand the implications. Then there would be another much smaller camp that would look at it and say, okay, so let me get this right. Somebody with a mind and a whole lot of tools and energy and chemicals put this together, and yet they haven't shown how that happened at the point of origin of life. Those would say, okay, that's really good science, but it doesn't prove that God didn't create the life to begin with.
And that's why I asked for both perspectives, is because I think that by and large, that's the ministry where Fuz works and that you're a part of as well, Mark, is Reasons to Believe. That's the position that's held by and large, but I don't know from that ministry, but I don't know that that's the broader Christian audience, and I wanted to make sure that everyone was represented here. Steve, why don't you bring us home here? The question here is, this is from Marina George, and Marina is asking, you said that physics, science would explain how a ball was thrown in the air and fell to the ground. Isn't the agent throwing the ball part of that explanation as well?
Okay, well, this goes into the whole equivocation issue with the word like causation, right? In the Aristotelian sense, he came up with like 4 different types of causes, right? One of the types of causes is called the efficient cause or the agent cause, the explanation for something. Basically, look at it as the antecedent to something. Why did this occur? What was the antecedent that made this occur in some kind of causal chain of connectivity, right? So you have a contingent thing, then you have something that caused that contingent thing, and something that had that. So there's a efficient cause, and this goes back to the prime mover argument, right? What was the first efficient cause, first prime mover that put everything in motion, right? Would that be the argument argument for movement? Motion, that's what it is. I had to think back to my Thomas type things. But when you're asking for like the cause of something, right? Why did the ball fly out of my hand? Why, if I hit a baseball, why did it fly that way? Well, a long time ago, they may have posited, well, angels are pushing this, right? God is constantly looking at that ball and focusing whatever, his omnipotence and making that ball move through the sky, right? He is the efficient cause for that, right? He's the from every step, every second, God's making that happen. But is that really an explanation? Is that an account for why the ball moves that way? Yeah, I mean, yes, in that sense, it would be an efficient cause. He would be the agent making that happen, right? But in science, the reason where we're looking for an accounting of why the ball does that is we're looking for a scientific theory. We're looking for a model that could be used for one, explanatory and predictability, which I don't think God would have, because again, we have to assume that he won't change things up. But that's what science wants to do. It wants to create a theory to explain the efficient causes of these things. What was the reasons for these things? What was the antecedent that made this happen, and made that happen, all down the line. So I think that her question makes a lot, it's a great question, but it really is an equivocation of what are we asking for? Are we asking for the reason why there's an agent that threw the ball? Or are we asking for the why the ball went from me to somebody else that I can model using science, right? I can use physics as a model to explain that. And I think that's a difference there.
And that is a wrap. That brings us to the end. And Mark, I just want to say thank you so much for coming on and joining us. This was a difficult one to take on. And
this is hard. Yeah, this is a lot harder than it looks.
It was a lot.
Takes a lot more time.
Yeah. It takes a lot
because
more time.
Mark probably agree. There's so many different rabbit holes you could go down. This topic is unreal.
Well, I'm beginning to appreciate that with this show, we never come to resolution, and we never.
You can't. I don't think you can.
And we never thoroughly, examine the topic. So I think
they're non-exhaustive topics. That's why. I
think it would be fun to revisit this topic at a future date, and maybe even bring Mark back on to bat around this issue some more.
that would be fantastic. Like you said, it's inexhaustible, but I think the whole point of ATA is not necessarily to come up with a conclusion. It is to, again, not just regurgitate canned answers, things that we've memorized. It's get into these things that they're not easily answered, and to realize that we don't agree. And at the end of this, guess what? We still don't agree. And that's okay. That's the whole point. That's the whole point of agree to argue, is that we can jump in this and we can look at each other's perspectives and we can agree to disagree and walk away friends. With that, Fuz, how do people follow you in social media? How can they?
Yeah, well, if people are interested in following me, I would just recommend that they check out the RTB official Facebook and Twitter social media accounts. That's a great way to start.
And Steve, how about you?
Just follow me by my name, Steve McCrae, on YouTube, and Steve McCrae _ on Twitter. Those are my, and on Facebook too. I had all 3 platforms.
And before everybody drops off, I just want to let people know, what better way to ring in the new year in 2021, reflecting back on 2020 and kind of encapsulating it in the topic of the hot topic of hell, right? I mean, I think that's the perfect thing on reflecting back over this past year. So with that, don't forget to subscribe so you don't miss an episode. Catch us on social media at agreetoargue.com and invite your friends to this discussion. Next month, like I said, we'll be taking on the hot topic of hell. Remember to bring your challenges, your curiosity, and your sense of humor when we come together again on Agree to Argue.